So, our topic tonight is the intersection of the soil microbiome, human microbiome, and health. And as the title suggests, we're going to talk about dirt and bacteria and other microorganisms and how the microbiome contributes in a major way to human health. And understanding and maintaining a healthy microbiome is increasingly recognized as important for preventing and treating various health conditions. And research into the microbiome is ongoing, and further insights into its role in the human health are being illuminated. So, for those of you that may not be familiar with the term, the microbiome refers to the complex community of around 100 trillion microorganisms, including bacteria and viruses and fungi and protozoa, that live in and on various parts of our bodies, with the highest density found in our GI tracts. So the microbiome plays a crucial role in maintaining human health and well-being. And here tonight to help us better understand this important topic, we have Dr. Samara Sterling. Dr. Sterling is a PhD. She's a registered dietitian. She's a diplomat of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. She is a nutrition scientist with a focus on the use of plant-based nutrition for the prevention and management of chronic diseases. She serves as the Research and Nutrition Director for the Peanut Institute, where she leads scientific affairs, research protocols, grant management, and is actively involved in regulatory issues and nutrition policy. She is also the principal investigator and director for clinical nutrition and lifestyle interventions focused on addressing issues surrounding nutrition and health equity. Dr. Sterling also serves as an adjunct professor of vegetarian nutrition at Andrews University. She regularly speaks for national and international audiences and is passionate about translating science into consumer-friendly messages. She is described as a natural leader and mentor with the ability to engage patients, research participants, and community members in ways that motivate them to make changes in their health. Welcome, Dr. Sterling. So glad to have you here this evening.
It's so good to be here this evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about this very important topic of the microbiome. We're talking about soil. We're going to talk about the human microbiome. So start us out. What makes a healthy human microbiome? How do we go about this?
So I think that's a great first question. And let me just say happy birthday to your dad as well. Awesome to
Yeah,
hear
thank
that.
you.
But as we start with a healthy gut microbiome, I think sort of laying the foundation of what the gut microbiome is, and you sort of alluded to that. Let me just add to that by saying the gut microbiome, we do see this as a community of microorganisms, as you've said, that includes bacteria, viruses, fungi, other microbes in our GI tract. And when we talk about the bacteria, that's sort of inherent to us as human beings. We find them in our mouths, we find them on our skins, but typically we see a lot of them in our guts, in our intestines. I will say that when we talk about the gut microbiome, it's very easy for it to sound sort of over our heads because you hear all these fancy names and you're like, am I supposed to remember all of these terms? Well, no, you don't have to. Okay, so that's the first place to start. Typically, when we talk about the gut microbiome and the bacteria specifically within the gut microbiome, we're going from general to specific. So if you remember from your biology classes, you may hear things like domain or kingdom. These are your broad umbrella terms for your bacteria that live within our gut. Think of that as like your family name. So my last name is Sterling. That would be that umbrella term. And as we get more specific, we get down to the genus and the species. These are smaller groups of bacteria. Well, to simplify this a bit, 90% of the bacteria species in our gut fall under two key phyla, or that umbrella group. Firmicutes is one, or it actually has a new name as of 2021, which is a little confusing, but the new name is Bacillota, but we'll use the term firmicutes, and Bacteria These are two key phyla that we find most bacterial species falling under. And we find these species like you've heard maybe lactobacillus that you find in plant-based yogurts or even fermented foods. Or there's another one called Prevotella that's under the Bacteroidota, under that umbrella. These are really important for helping to maintain a healthy body weight, stimulating our immune system, even heart health. So now, as we move from what these species are, let's now move into the question about what a healthy gut microbiome is. And I will tell you at the outset that that's actually very hard to define, and I'll tell you why. It's for the first reason is that there's a lot of inter-individual variability. So your microbiome is determined by your diet, but it's also determined by the environment in which you live. So someone who lives in Idaho, for example, may have a very different starting place of gut microbiome than someone who lives in Northern Africa, right? A person's state of health at baseline can also impact the composition of the gut microbiome. So there are really hard metrics that we try to use to define what a healthy gut is. Now, with that said, there are some key principles that we can use to define that. And there are two principles I'll give you. Number one is balance, and number two is diversity. So the balance of our gut microbiome, or specifically the bacteria, means that we really want things to be evened out, so to speak. And you may hear it being said that there really isn't such a thing as good bacteria and bad bacteria. And in some ways that may actually be true. It's about how balanced that entire environment is. So I talked about the two key phyla, Firmicutes and Bacteroidota, right? When we see an off-balance ratio of the two, we see an implication for certain diseases. And we actually call this something, we call it the F&B ratio, Firmicutes to Bacteroidota ratio. When Firmicutes is too high, this is implicated in obesity and a lot of metabolic disorders like heart disease, type 2 diabetes even. When you have too much Bacteroidota, that actually is associated with higher risk of inflammatory bowel disease or gut disorders. So I will say that there's no single ideal ratio, but typically what we hear is that we want about 2-to-1 Firmicutes to Bacteroidota. However, that balance is super important. And then secondly, last thing I'll say is that diversity, as we talked about, that is one key principle that helps to define what a healthy gut is. It's diversity. And how do we get a diverse gut? So the more diverse our diets can be, the more stable and diverse our gut microbiomes can be. And this is actually why, for example, you may see that if someone may have persistent, take antibiotics persistently, right? Or the overuse of antibiotics, they may end up with infections like yeast infections and other types of infections. And that's because the antibiotics are getting rid of the pathogenic bacteria. They can also decrease the diversity of some of the other good bacteria for overall health, and that disrupts that balance and also the diversity of the gut. So I would say, number one, balance. Number two, diversity. I know we'll talk a little bit more about diet and how that might play into how we can have the healthiest microbiome, but these are the two key principles that I'll have us go by just for now.
Yeah, that's great. Setting that foundation of balance and diversity. And it's fascinating what you're saying about how that balance can be adjusted one way or the other and make you more prone to certain diseases. That's amazing, fascinating. So in our title, we talked about soil. Can you explain what the soil microbiome is and how it compares in diversity and function to the human microbiome?
So what's fascinating is that we have typically thought of both of these worlds as very separate, but what we'll start to see throughout this time together is that they're very much interconnected. So just as how we have a human microbiome, the soil also has its own ecosystem of the microbiome as well. And that also includes your bacteria, your fungi, your viruses, archaea, and other types of microorganisms there. And soil health, when we talk about what a healthy soil is, it's the ability of that soil to sustain the health of plants and humans because it is healthy in and of itself. And integral within the health of that soil is the microbiome of the soil. And bacteria is really what makes up the largest number and a significant portion of the soil microorganisms. And in fact, some statistics here, a single gram of soil, and that's about a quarter teaspoon of soil, contains up to 1 billion bacteria. That is
Wow.
amazing. And actually, it's said that the bacteria that we have in the soil actually outnumbers humans on Earth in just a handful, in just one handful. So we actually, within the soil though, we find bacteria or microbes all along the continuum of the soil and the plant. So first, we find them sort of at the base near the roots of the plants. This is what we call the rhizosphere. This zone is very active and alive with microbial activity. And it's where we see most of that activity there. So it actually provides nutrients to the plant itself, and they actually work in a symbiotic relationship. So the plant provides nutrients to those bacteria in the soil, and the soil in turn releases compounds that provide nutrients to the plant itself. And also the microbes are allowed to do that. Within the plant, there's also the endosphere. So the plant itself has microbes within the tissues. And then on top of the plant, or the surface of the plant, this is called the phyllosphere, you also have some of those bacteria there as well. What's fascinating is that these microbes in the soil and along the continuum in the plant are also there to help the plant absorb nutrients and protect the organism from disease. Now, you asked a question about how it compares in diversity and function to the human microbiome. So I'll say that the soil itself is way more diverse. So I talked about 1 billion bacteria in just a quarter teaspoon of soil. That's about 50,000 bacterial species. Well, the human microbiome, we are estimating, has about 3,000 species. So way more diverse for the soil itself. But in general, they both function very similarly, and their function is really to help with nutrient absorption and overall health of the organism. And the human microbiome, just like the soil microbiome, is actually crucial for helping us to absorb nutrients efficiently. One example that comes to mind is vitamin K, for example, for the human microbiome. We know that when babies are born, they have to receive a shot of vitamin K because their gut is not fully developed. The gut bacteria is important for producing that vitamin K and a host of other vitamins. So just like the soil is producing those vitamins for the plant in order for that plant to be healthy for the human beings to eat, it's the same way that the human microbiome is helping with the production of nutrients in order to keep our human organism healthy.
Very nice. Very nice. So we're seeing a paradigm shift. Most people think of bacteria as something bad, bacterial infection, right? But you're opening a different paradigm saying bacteria are good as long as we keep in the right, balance and diversity. It can be really, really good for our bodies.
Yes, yes. And I think we're still learning a little bit more about this area because there are definitely pathogens out there, right? And so we have to also be aware of that. However, like you mentioned, I think the key there is that balance.
Mhm.
There may not necessarily be that good/bad bacteria that we're accustomed to talking about, but that balance and diversity may really be what's key.
Yeah, yeah. So what's out there in the evidence, the research? What does it say about the link between the soil microbiome and human health?
Hmm. So I would say this is so fascinating for me as a nutrition scientist within the agricultural industry. And it is a concept that is fairly recent, because if you look over the past 20 years or so, gut microbiome studies 20 years ago, you maybe saw about 4 of them in 1 year, whereas just as of this year, we have over 15,000 studies. So it's still
Wow.
a pretty relatively new area of study. And then combining the two, or that intersection between the two, that's even newer. But I'll give you 3 examples that may appear to be a bit indirect, but when you hear them, you'll recognize that it really is a continuum of how the soil microbiome and the human microbiome are linked. The first is nitrogen fixation. You may have heard this term, it's a buzzword. And what this is that it's the ability of soil or bacteria within the soil to be able to sequester or get nitrogen from the atmosphere, turn it into a form that the plant can use, which is ammonia, and then the plant is able to use that nitrogen in order to build protein. There are actually very specific bacteria within the soil microbiome that helps with the plant sequestering nitrogen. And if those bacteria are not there, then the plant is unable to do that. You find stunted growth, et cetera, et cetera. And we find it to be a key feature of some plants like soybeans, fava beans, lentils, peanuts, other legumes, beans and peas, for example. These are nitrogen fixing plants, and they have the ability to do that because of the soil microbes that are sequestering that nitrogen from the atmosphere. Of course, when the plant is able to now build protein from that nitrogen, and then we consume that awesome, nutritious plant-based protein source, then of course, we get the benefits from plant-based protein that we may have all heard about, such as reducing our risk for chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, certain cancers. It functions as growth repair for muscles, bones, skin, hair, etc. And the reason we are able to get such good plant-based protein sources is literally tied to the soil microbes. I'll give you another one. And there was a study that was done so that's my first example, nitrogen fixation. The second one is certain antioxidants, and I'll focus on selenium. So there are many nutrients that we find in the soil that are dependent on soil health. And selenium is one of those. It's one that, for myself studying nutrition, we hear all the time. Selenium is dependent on the soil. So in your Brazil nuts and your whole grains and your sunflower seeds. There was one study in 2023 that was done in China where the researchers decided to add 2 components to the soil to see if they could increase the selenium content of vegetables, specifically bok choy vegetable. And what they added was a specific strain of bacteria called Pseudomonas maltophilia. You don't have to remember that name, and a specific type of fungi that functions as a bit of a network under the soil for those bacteria to be able to travel through and get to the plant. When they added these 2 microbes, the fungi and the bacteria, what they found was that it increased the concentration of selenium within that plant by, get this, 90 to 234%. Just by adding these 2 microbes to the soil, it literally doubled the amount of selenium that they got from the bok choy that they were eating, just by enriching the microbes. And of course, we know the value of selenium, right, for human beings. So when the plant has that and we consume selenium-rich foods, we are producing an array of antioxidants that help to fight against cancer, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, and the list goes on and on. That's my second example. My last example that I'll give you, and I love talking about this one, this is, if you've ever heard the term phytoalexins, not a very common term. If anybody has heard it, awesome. So phytoalexins are these antimicrobial compounds that are produced by the plant whenever a plant is under stress. So whether that's pests in the wild or weather conditions, whatever stress the plant is under, it tends to produce these phytoalexins. And more recent research is recognizing that phytoalexins are also beneficial, not just for the plants, but for the human beings who consume them. So in the same way that the phytoalexins fight against stress for the plant, is the same way that it fights against stress in our human bodies when we consume them. And while phytoalexins are not directly created by the microbiome in the soil, they're actually triggered by the microbiome in the soil. So it's very much dependent on the soil microbiome. And one example is brassinin. And this, you may not know the term brassinin, but you've probably heard of brassica vegetables. So brassica vegetables like your cabbage, your Brussels sprouts, your broccoli, these all have the phytoalexin called brassinin, and it defends the plant. When we consume brassica vegetables, evidence shows that it helps our guts in a similar way. It actually reduces the amount of specific bacteria that are linked to symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. One that you may have heard of, a phytoalexin that you may have heard of, is resveratrol. We hear of resveratrol for a lot of people eat them in the skins of red grapes or wine, etc., however you choose. But resveratrol is a potent antioxidant that is also a phytoalexin for that plant, triggered by the soil microbiome. And then when we consume it, it helps our gut microbiome by balancing the bacteria that's in our gut. And then we see the effects with weight management, cancer protection, and brain health. So that interconnectedness between the soil microbiome and the human microbiome is really fascinating. And the last thing I'll say is that we've found that it's actually a bit bi-directional. So when human beings, when we pass, for example, our body returns to the earth, and those microbes actually become our necrobiome, and they're primary agents to help to bring the body's nutrients back into the ecosystem to support the life of the soil. And then the soil itself, through the plant, continues to support the health of human beings. So it's a fascinating area of study that we continue to see there with that interconnectedness.
Yeah, that's amazing to think about all those things interplaying with the bacteria, transferring to the plant. And then when we eat that whole plant, we're getting all that stuff. We don't have to rely on supplements that don't work like the whole plant does. Dr. Campbell always tells us, eat the whole plant. Don't try to isolate out this or that. But that explains some of this, the nutrition value of a plant, simple plant. And
Yes.
you were mentioning, the cruciferous vegetables. They're amazing. All kinds of stuff in those vegetables.
Yes, for sure. And what I'll also add to what you said is that these nutrients within the whole plants also work in what we call a synergistic fashion.
Yes.
So food synergy is this operational concept, which means that when you combine, when you eat certain nutrients together, as you find within a whole food, a whole plant, it's as if 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, but 1 + 1 can equal 4 in terms of the effects that it has on your body. And so when you separate those nutrients from the whole plant, you may get isolated benefits, but you don't get the full benefit that you would by eating that whole plant itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So while our gut microbiomes are largely shaped by our diet, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, sometimes our genetics, other factors, what kind of role do you think the natural environmental exposures play to shape and restore some of that diversity in our gut microbiome?
So that's a good question. So I think that what we found is that in recent decades, and there have been a few studies that have tracked the diversity in our gut microbiome over time as society has become more urbanized. And what we found is that there has been this global loss of biodiversity. And there was a 2019 paper that was published that talks about that, which is really unfortunate. And especially when we find that folks move from different countries to westernized societies, rural to urban environments, we see that. Now, how can we get some tips in terms of restoring that balance for our gut microbiomes? Well, what we found is that natural exposures to soil can actually be helpful. So we see this in children and immunity and immune system development. So there's some evidence that children who grew up on farms they tend to have a lower risk of certain immune-mediated disorders, such as asthma or allergies, when they have more contact with their natural environment. They tend to be less susceptible to certain diseases. And we've seen that even just this idea of being so clean as a
Mhm.
society may take away from some of that. And so that is one thing that I can say practically is even if you do live in an urban environment, how can we think about moving towards greener spaces, even temporarily, if it's a weekend or even if it's going to the park, where whatever your environment may be, how can we prioritize green spaces within that space that we have? The other thing is that for adults, we've seen some research on grounding. So if you're not familiar with grounding, so grounding is basically us coming in contact with the natural earth, whether by walking bare feet on the soil or on the beach in sand. And we found that this helps with, there's some research that it may help with reducing inflammation in the gut, helping to balance the gut microbiome, improving blood flow, increasing gut motility. And so one of the things that's recommended there is for practitioners and their patients to eat at least one meal grounded outside daily. It's something that I actually practice myself, in your backyard, on your porch. Try to eat at least one meal grounded outside. And I'll say one other thing that I'll say is when it comes on to how we can help to restore that balance, um, there's a lot of evidence coming now about the value of a whole food plant-based diet and how that can help with that. And by a whole food plant-based diet, I mean centering our plates around foods in their natural states, are plant foods that are in their natural state. So your nuts, your seeds, your fruits, your vegetables, and your whole grains, and your legumes. And so earlier this year, in January 2025, there was a study that was published in Nature Microbiology, and it looked at over 20,000 individuals. And what it wanted to do was to look at the gut microbiome signatures or group of microbes together within the gut of individuals who are following various dietary patterns, either a fully plant-based diet, so vegan diet, a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet, and an omnivore diet. And they wanted to correlate the gut microbes that you see in each of these individuals with health risks, specifically for heart disease. And what they found was fascinating for myself was that the folks who were on that plant-based, fully plant-based vegan diet, whole food plant-based diet, they actually had the gut microbiome signature that was very similar to the plant and soil microbiome, and that this in turn was correlated with more favorable heart health outcomes.
Nice.
They literally had some of these bacterial species in their guts. And those who did not follow those dietary patterns, they tended to take on the bacterial colonies of the foods that they were eating. So even some of the pathogenic bacteria that you may find in red meat, for example, those who are on the omnivorous diet had higher levels of those, and that was correlated negatively with heart disease risk, so higher risks for heart disease. So we start to see that continuum just by following certain dietary patterns, grounding, and also being in contact with nature more often.
Nice, nice. So one of the take home messages from that is let your kids play in the dirt. And as an allergist immunologist, I recommend to my patients, I say, your kids need to get outside for a lot of reasons, sunshine, fresh air, but let them play in the dirt. It's okay to get dirty, and you're reinforcing that right now.
Yes, of course. And it's okay and it's also helpful,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Which again, we don't typically think of it that way, but it's amazing to do that.
Yeah. So you talked about this microbiome imbalance, and can you walk us through some of the evidence-backed associations between these microbiome imbalances? We call it dysbiosis, And some of the chronic diseases yet you mentioned, like irritable bowel disease and metabolic syndrome and neurodegenerative conditions. Tell us about that because this is really fascinating and important.
Sure. So you mentioned dysbiosis. So for those who are not familiar, dysbiosis is what happens when there's a disruption or imbalance within our microbial communities. So remember, I talked about that balance before. So you don't necessarily have the balance that you should have. And so in terms of the evidence between associating dysbiosis with chronic disease outcome, I'll start with metabolic disorders or metabolic syndrome, which is a cluster of conditions that increase your risk for things like heart disease and type 2 diabetes. I'll focus a bit on obesity because this was one of the first studies. There was one study that was done in 2013 that started to look at these association between the gut microbiome and metabolism, and specifically obesity. So what they did here was that researchers implanted the fecal microbiome, not suggesting you do that at home, but the fecal microbiome of obese twins in one set of mice. And in another set of mice, they implanted the fecal microbiome of lean twins. They fed the obese twins a diet that was high in saturated fat, so a lot of your meats and your fats, and low in fruits and vegetables. The other set of mice, the lean mice, they gave high fruits and vegetables, low in meats and saturated fats. What was interesting was that for the lean mice, they tended to maintain their weight regardless of the diet that they were consuming, even if they switched. The obese mice, though, they tended to gain weight regardless of what they were doing. However, when they switched to a diet that was higher in fruits and vegetables, they started to take on a phenotype or a characteristic of the lean mice. So in other words, they started to lose weight. And what was also fascinating was that when they housed both groups of mice together, the obese mice, regardless of what they were eating, actually also took on the characteristics of the lean mice and they became more lean. So that also speaks to the impact of environment. I'm not saying that if we hang out with friends who have better health than we would like to have, that this is always transferable, but that is interesting how environment can play a role. But what we saw from this study was, number one, that just by implanting a microbiome that was imbalanced, that could actually transmit obesity. And that secondly, diet and environment could alter that. So it did not mean that the obese mice needed to stay that way. Just by changing the diet, it could actually alter outcomes for obesity. And of course, we know altering outcomes for obesity can also decrease your risk for things like heart disease. Now, what about things like certain gut disorders, like inflammatory bowel disease? So inflammatory bowel disease is basically inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. It typically includes Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis that can affect various parts of the GI tract. One of the things that we found consistently in studies is that patients who have IBD or inflammatory bowel disease have reduced diversity of key bacterial species within their gut. And it's specifically those bacteria that help to digest fibers and to produce what we call short chain fatty acids from the fibers. So when the gut takes fiber and digests fiber, it transforms it into these compounds, we call them metabolites, called short chain fatty acids. And when they are transformed to these short chain fatty acids, then those short chain fatty acids are then able to reduce our risk for heart disease, help us with weight management, and also they are anti-inflammatory, so it reduces inflammation in your gut. So now, if patients with IBD are unable to produce that bacteria or don't have the bacteria to digest fiber, to produce the short chain fatty acids that then reduce your inflammation, well, then it's not surprising why IBD itself would be characterized by inflammation of the gut. And number two, inability to digest certain fibers. So we see that connection very clearly. And it's why, as myself as a lifestyle medicine practitioner, if a patient has IBD, what we may need to do for a short period of time is go on a diet that is called a low FODMAP diet to help the patient to actually get back into a space where you can digest some of these fibers. So we see gut-related disorders really connected to the gut microbiome. And then the last thing I'll say with the dysbiosis is that it is also connected with neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. We have seen that in both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's, there's also a reduction in the diversity of the gut microbiome, and specifically those that can digest fibers and produce short chain fatty acids. What's really interesting with the gut and neurodegenerative disorders or brain disorders is that we're now finding something called the gut-brain axis.
Yeah.
And Alzheimer's disease medications, it's one of the reasons why they are so ineffective. In fact, recent statistics say they're about 98% ineffective, is because the drugs themselves are unable to cross that blood-brain barrier. What is fascinating is that when we eat certain foods that are high in antioxidants, so your fruits and your vegetables contain certain compounds called antioxidants. When they get to your gut transforms them into a form that evidence shows can actually cross that blood-brain barrier and target specific centers in your brain that may help to reduce your risk for neurodegenerative diseases. I'll give you one. One is called p-coumaric acid. It's a polyphenol that you find in many plant foods. We've actually found that that's able to target a neurotransmitter called GABA in the brain. It helps to modulate mood outcomes. And there was one study in 2014 that even said that it's similar in its effect to some of the most powerful depression and anxiety medications. So we see that foods can modulate or change the composition of our gut microbiome, help it to be more balanced so that we don't have that dysbiosis, and it can help with improving functions in our brains, in our GI tract for gut disorders, and even for metabolism for obesity.
Yeah, excellent. Well, you're building an excellent case for the microbiome and its importance in our health. And so I hesitate to ask this next question because I think I know your answer, but do you see the microbiome as a central or peripheral factor in chronic disease management?
Well, so I'll say this. So it's estimated that we have about 2 times more bacterial cells than we have human cells.
Yeah.
So you can think of it as some people may even say we're more bacteria than we are human. I wouldn't say that, but I may say that maybe a big part of us being human includes the bacteria that we have, right? It's integrated. And if we think about it that way, then it's easy to see why this would not be a peripheral factor. It's definitely central, right?
Yeah.
It was Hippocrates. Of course, we know Hippocrates is quoted as saying, "Let food be thy medicine," right? But he's also quoted as saying, "All diseases begin in the gut." And we're seeing some truth to that. And we're seeing the interconnectedness of both of those statements. Because if all diseases begin in the gut and food should be our medicine, then putting those two together, food, the gut, that's very much central to our health and even in chronic disease management.
Yeah. I think we should be nurturing our microbiomes more than we are currently. Yeah. So, what are some of the major research gaps in understanding how the soil microbiome impacts our human microbiome and disease risk?
So I think that there are a lot of gaps, again, because we're so new in understanding this. So number one, I don't think that we fully understand, because there's so many microbes within the soil itself. We don't fully understand the ideal ratios of those various bacteria within the soil and how those ratios translate to the human organism. Or I will say this, so the plant has a natural filtration system. How it filters that from the microbes within the soil to say, okay, well, these are the microbes that I'm going to have within my tissues. And then these are the microbes that I'm going to give human beings access to. Not that the plant is thinking, but you understand what I mean.
Sure.
So how do we get to defining those ideal ratios and that filtration system? And what that does also, we don't really know the mechanistic pathways of how the soil microbiome really impacts human health. So we can see that we have contact with them, but when it's then transferred to our gut microbiome, how does it change? Is it very similar to what we find in the soil? And yes, we've seen some research there, but what about the ones that change? Why do they change? How do they change? And how does that change then impact our health? Then, of course, there's the question of what about the bacteria that are not so friendly? How does that fit into our overall picture of soil microbiome and health? What if we come in contact with other pathogens that may not necessarily be as friendly depending on our health state or depending on the balance that we currently have? How does that fit into the overall picture? So I think that once we start getting at some of these macro questions, then we can move to more granular detail to understand some of those specifics. But I think there are a lot of questions that are needed to be asked there.
Yeah, yeah. So, have you come across any clinical trials or translational research that explores soil-based microbial therapies or interventions?
So the studies that have are small in scale. So we really do need to amplify those studies. I'll say that geophagia, which is eating soil directly, is something that has been practiced for decades. I'm gonna say right now, just in case anybody, snips this from YouTube, this is not my recommendation. Please don't go outside and eat a spoonful of soil, okay? But there have been studies that have been looking at more indirect ways of having contact with those soil microbes. There was an interesting one that in 2018 that took a small number of volunteers, only 14 volunteers for a couple of weeks. And what they did was that in the intervention arm, the participants were instructed to rub their hands in microbially rich soil for 20 minutes, 3 times per day before your meals, and then again before bedtime. And then they were to wash their hands for only 5 seconds, no soap. And then they were to eat their meals, right? So you can see this contact that they're having with the gut microbes. And interestingly, from that study, the intervention group did have greater gut diversity by the end of the trial. And they did also have higher levels of a protein that has to do with balancing your immune function. So that was one that was interesting. I will say that the results have been mixed in this area, where most appear to show some positive benefits, but some results are a little bit more neutral in terms of the effect of doing that. Let me just quickly say what's the application of all of this. So I would say that may be a strategy that someone may want to try, but I'm not recommending that. However, what we can say is that for each of us, wherever we are in our journey, we can all eat more plants. And remember, as we talked about the continuum from the soil microbiome to the plant to the human being, you are actually getting in contact with those soil microbes just by eating the plants. And the benefit that you have is that the plant is giving you that natural filtration system so that the microbes that you need to be in contact with will be the ones that you're in contact with. So I would say that there are more studies that need to be done in this area, but that's one application. We can all eat more plants.
Yeah, yeah. So when we play in the dirt, we should still wash our hands, but maybe not as quite as thoroughly as we did in the past, maybe. I'm not
Yes,
sure,
yes.
but yeah. So kids come in from playing, we always say, wash your hands, wash your hands. Well, maybe not so much. Yeah.
Right.
So what role, if any, might soil microbiome restoration, like regenerative agriculture, play in long-term public health strategies?
So I think this is huge when it comes on to public health and how we can integrate a holistic view of what health looks like. So regenerative agriculture basically encourages gardening or farming practices that includes factors like responsible use of synthetic chemicals, or making sure that your soil is healthy, increasing biodiversity, so many different areas of regenerative agriculture. Now, within the field of public health, we tend to separate all of these areas. So let's just think about the clinical setting, for example. We may say, eat your fruits and vegetables. And that is great to advise to eat for our patients to eat their fruits and vegetables. But if you think about it this way, let's say you're on a 2,000 calorie diet, and this is what's optimal for your body, and you're following these recommendations. You're eating at least 5 servings of fruits and 5 servings of vegetables per day. You're eating at least half your plates of fruits or half your plate of vegetables. You eat your plant-based protein and a quarter plate of your whole grain. Now, think back to the example that I gave you of selenium in the soil and how that was doubled just by adding certain microbes in the soil. So let's say you're eating this nutrient-dense plate, as nutritious as you can get it, but the soil itself was not the healthiest that the soil could be. What could actually happen to your health if we were able, as a society, to double the nutrition of that meal, not by doubling the calories of that meal, but simply by doubling the microbes or the nutrients that are in that soil, because those foods are grown in optimal soil? That could lead to huge benefits in our health, because we are maximizing the nutrition of the foods that we're eating. So we're talking quality of food now, not just the quantity of food. And I think it would be really a revolutionary idea for long-term public health strategies.
Yeah, yeah, very important, very important. Our soil is getting kind of anemic, if you will, with some of the habits that farmings and are having today. So staying on that kind of topic, how could integrating soil and environmental microbiome data impact patient care in certain populations? I'm thinking autoimmune, inflammatory diseases. How would that play?
I think for myself as a scientist, I really recognize the power of data, because data helps us to generate evidence. And for many of the lifestyle medicine approaches that we ourselves follow or we may recommend to our loved ones, that data is powerful because pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? When you actually see it in front of you. For a lot of people, that's what they need, right? And what that can do, soil and environmental microbiome data can help us to understand more behind the mechanisms of some of the things that we may already do, like getting outside in the sun, putting your feet in the soil, being around the trees, and why that's so important. And that data could help us to also be now integrated within clinical settings. And, personal story of mine, I remember when my father, before he passed, he was in a rehab facility, as he was trying to get over his illness. And I remember we would be there with him 24/7. And one of the things that he would often say is, I just want to go outside. This was a small facility. I just want to go outside. And
Yes.
we did everything we could. Can we just put him in a wheelchair, get him outside just so he can see the sun, just so he can be around nature? But of course, liability issues, or, we can't, that's too risky, etc. All these different reasons, can't go outside. Now,
Mm.
that's just one example of mine, but I'm sure many of us on this line have examples of our own. What would it do to patient care if we thought of our patients as holistic beings who need to be outside, who need to be in contact with nature as an integral part of their health, not just as this luxury or icing on the cake, something that you top their care with? I think that having that data hopefully could over time translate to even the way we choose to care for our patients.
Yeah, yeah, very important. I always tell my patients, get outside, get some sunshine, some fresh air, do something outside. Even it's wintertime, go outside, put your coat on and enjoy the outdoors. Yeah, very, very important. So, Dr. Sterling, you've really given us a lot of science and a lot to think about. It's been really good. We have about 5 minutes left. What I'd like to do now is have you take us through some practical steps, addressing that person that maybe is already plant-based, and also addressing the person that says, my gut is a wreck. I eat a lot of processed foods. I'm not, I don't even know what fiber is, that sort of thing. What advice would you give somebody that wants to fine tune their gut microbiome or completely, rebuild it and restore it? What would you suggest for us?
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is there is hope for everybody on this line.
There you go.
Because what we found in the research is that your gut microbiome can actually change in as little as 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, right? And so as we make small changes towards our health, we recognize that this can actually be really beneficial. So what I'll say in terms of diet, and then I'll also talk a little bit about exercise and sleep. If I forget, please remind me. But 3 words for diet: fiber, polyphenols, probiotics. Maybe I'll say 6 words: fiber, fiber, fiber,
Yeah, there you
polyphenols,
go.
and probiotics. So your fiber and your polyphenols are what make your fruits and vegetables certain colors. So they're your antioxidants that fight against damage in your cells. These are your prebiotics. So these are foods that feed your bacteria. So you want to make sure for fiber that you're getting at least 40 grams per day. 40 grams of fiber per day, and you want to vary the types of fiber that you consume. So it's not enough to just say, I'm eating my fruits and vegetables, so I'll just eat white flour all day, because there are different types of fibers in the foods that you eat. So fiber is really important. You also want to make sure that so we talked about filling your plate, half your plate with fruits and vegetables, or fruits or vegetables. I like to say fruits with breakfast, vegetables with lunch. And one tip I like to give is when you eat your salads, which I think we should all have salads every day if you can. When you eat your salads, try to have at least 5 colors in that salad, because those colors are going to be what promote your polyphenols that have variety of benefits. So, and I don't need to go through all of them because we don't have much time here, but you want to have at least 5 colors. Just remember that the more diverse our diets can be, the more stable our microbiome will be. So when you go grocery shopping, go for the week, plan for the week, not just for one day, and try to pick up at least one new fruit and one new vegetable each week. This will help to diversify your diet, your whole grains. You don't have to just eat bread. You can include oats, millet. There's so many different types of grains that can be included, and your beans, your legumes. There's chickpeas, there's black beans, there's pinto beans. Vary those fruits, those vegetables, those legumes, those nuts. And I think once we get to that place where we're diversifying, that's where we have the optimal health for our gut microbiome. But wherever you're starting, start small and increase those goals day by day. And then you'll see some health benefits that I'm sure you will be proud of.
Excellent. You're going to talk about exercise and sleep too.
Yes. So there was one study that showed that exercising, especially in the open air, can actually increase the diversity of your gut microbiome and those short chain fatty acids that we talked about in as little as 6 weeks. So just exercising 30 minutes per day, at least 5 days per week, can actually increase the balance and the diversity of your gut microbiome. So diet is important, but also exercise. There was another study that found that even partial sleep deprivation can reduce the diversity of your gut microbiome in as little as 48 hours.
Wow.
Just 2 days. And that tells us why sleep is so important. So yes, nutrition is there as well, but also make sure you're exercising, make sure you're drinking your water, getting your sunshine and getting out in nature, and also getting adequate sleep.
Excellent. Yeah. So for those of you that are stuck on that 40 grams of fiber that Dr. Sterling recommended, just 1 cup of beans has 15 grams of fiber. So it's pretty easy to get it if you're doing plant-based and that diversified, balanced diet that's including lots of different fruits and vegetables and grains and beans and that sort of thing. You'll get your 40 grams easily. Yeah,
Yes, yes. And let me just add and say that animals don't contain fiber.
that's
So
right.
you may not it'll be harder for you to get closer to that. So whole food plant-based really is the way to go.
Yeah, animals have a monopoly on cholesterol and plants have a monopoly on fiber. So
That's
yeah,
right.
exactly. So I think we'll address this in the Q&A because we're 1 minute past 8, I think. So Natasha, you come in. While you're coming in, the first question, you are going to address probiotics as well in the last part. If you want to address probiotics, and then Natasha will give you some questions.
Okay, so for probiotics, I will say that for myself as a nutrition scientist, you probably know where I'm going with this. I tend to recommend whole foods over supplements wherever possible.
Perfect.
Of course, there may be situations, let's say if somebody's on antibiotics and you may need a special situation that's different. But for if you would like to have access to more live bacteria, some of your fermented foods like kimchi or plant-based yogurt, sauerkraut, these are good options because they do give you a wide array of those live bacteria. One caveat I'll mention is that you do want to make sure that like your sauerkraut is not soaked in vinegar. There's some evidence that the vinegar may actually dilute or even decrease the amount of those microbes that you have. So if you can find a good home recipe for that kimchi or just find one that's sort of in its own brine, that's probably the best idea. But your kimchi, your sauerkraut, tempeh, and plant-based yogurts, those are good sources for your probiotics.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Natasha, welcome back.
Thank you. So, Dr. Sterling, are you ready for rapid fire questions? Because this Q&A has been blowing up. And we have a lot of excellent questions, and I'm going to shoot them at you, and you're going to answer them as fast as possible, right?
Okay.
Okay. All right, here we go. So this person is asking about mouthwashes and how they affect the microbiome because they are kind of at odds right now with their dentist. So what can you say about mouthwashes and their effect on the microbiome?
Yes, there's some evidence that the alcohol in some mouthwashes plus the artificial colors can impact the oral microbiome. So if you want more natural approaches, essential oils like peppermint oil, clove oil, eucalyptus oil, diluting that in some water and using that as a mouthwash, that can also be effective.
Nice.
Great. Thank you so much. So could you talk a little bit about where toxins, in our modern food supply come from, kind of how they end up in the foods we eat, and what can we do to protect our gut and overall health from potential exposure? In 4 or 5 minutes, right? No.
Yeah.
That's a little more than a rapid fire question,
Yeah.
but
I wanted to get that in early.
A lot of the toxins come from our water, our lead pipes that we may have, agricultural runoff, some of the animals that are in the system release some of these pollutants. Then there are persistent organic pollutants like dioxins, some of these that are in our system. The main key that I want to mention is that there are natural detoxification methods that our bodies can do. Sleep, I mentioned, is one of them. Quickly, I'll say one study found that exercising with sweat actually releases a lot of heavy metals like lead, like zinc, and even arsenic within that sweat. So exercising is really key. And then fiber is also able to bind to many of those toxins in our guts and actually flush them out. So drinking your water, getting your fiber is a great way to detoxify.
I think that was pretty good as far as rapid fire. Is there any positive research about the gut microbiome and the health influences that it might have on neurological diseases like Parkinson's, for example, that you're aware of?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. We know that did you say Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's, or either or?
Yeah, kind of either or. This one mentioned Parkinson's specifically, but
Okay, so for Parkinson's disease, what we find in general, as I mentioned before, that there's a reduction of those short chain fatty acids that's coming from a reduction in those bacteria that's able to digest the fibers. So in general, increasing that fiber intake can help with those bacteria to improve the production of short chain fatty acids, and that can help. I'll also mention if a patient is not on L-DOPA, fava beans are also high in L-DOPA, and that also interacts with the gut microbiome and can also be helpful within a lifestyle medicine context, but you do want to check with your healthcare provider on that.
excellent. Thank you very much. So you mentioned grounding, and I think that topic is new to a lot of people. And I'm sure that people are saying, okay, well, how can I do that? So when you mentioned eating outdoors, do you mean physically sitting on the ground, having a picnic, your feet on the ground at a table? Can you explain that a little more for those who really want to embrace this concept?
Sure, thanks for that question. What I mean is you can do either or. Grounding is just coming in contact with your environment, with the earth itself. What I typically do, I sit outside on my back porch and my feet are on the ground. So my feet are touching the grass, right? Doesn't mean that I have to put my plate on the grass and then ants get in the plate or anything like that. If you would like to have a picnic and do that, that's totally fine. But it just means having that contact. So you can sit on a chair, put your feet on the ground, and that's perfectly fine. It's recommended about 30 minutes per day, or at least one meal per day.
Thank you. That was excellent as far as being prescriptive and explicit in the guidance. Are food allergies potentially due to gut imbalance? And then there was another question about celiac disease and kind of like, so allergies and celiac, what is the connection there with gut imbalance?
These are a little bit different because obviously celiac is an autoimmune disease. Of course, it's immune mediated, but there's a different pathway there. I actually have an entire lecture on celiac disease, but yes, it is. There is evidence that celiac disease at the foundation could be related to dysbiosis that we find within the gut microbiome. For allergies, I do work within the agricultural industry, the peanut industry, and that is one of the things that we talk about a lot is allergies. And we do find that allergies, specifically the mother's gut microbiome, that is then transferred to the child, is associated with increased risks for food allergies, which also increases your risk for other conditions like eczema and psoriasis. So yes, there is some evidence.
Great, thank you very much. So you were talking about healthy gut bacteria that cross the blood-brain barrier. Can you give some other examples of compounds produced by those healthy gut bacteria that cross the blood-brain barrier?
So these compounds are called microbial phenolic metabolites, or MPMs, and typically it's coming from the polyphenols that we're consuming. And when the gut interacts with these polyphenols, and it could be lycopene that you get from tomatoes, it could be p-cumaric acid that you get from potatoes, it could also be beta carotene that you get from carrots. When the gut microbiome interacts with these polyphenols, it literally changes the composition of them. And that composition is what literally reacts with transmitters within the brain. It's able to cross the blood-brain barrier. And it's where we see outcomes related to not just mood and anxiety, but also things like memory, processing speed, so how fast you're able to process information. Mostly what we see is in the domains of memory and processing speed and general cognition. So those polyphenols, you want to get them from your fruits and vegetables. Remember, you're varying those colors, your tomatoes, your carrots, your potatoes, etc. And we find the gut microbiome can transform them to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Wonderful, thank you. So this person has heard that a few physicians outside the US have done some fecal transplants from healthy patients into those whose health has been compromised, and they have had some success. Are you familiar with these studies, and do you have any comments on that?
So I'm briefly familiar, sort of familiar with fecal transplants, but not enough to where I want to comment on it. I know that there are some who experience success with it, and that's okay. Whether or not I would choose that for myself, it's a little bit, I would say it's a little bit controversial right now. And it depends on who you speak with. I would probably try as best as I can as the first route to go with how can I change my own microbiome through my environment, through my diet, through my lifestyle, before going directly to other routes such as a fecal transplant.
Yeah, I would interject that I've seen some suggestion that treating Clostridium difficile with fecal transplant maybe has some benefit there, but I agree that's not something we want to, promote right now, but it's being studied.
Yes.
Thank you for bringing that up. So soils around the world are being degraded with excessive fertilizer, support for monocultures. What can consumers do about potentially degraded access to the soil microbiome? Because this was a theme through many of the questions this evening, everything from pesticides to monocultures to, just industrial agriculture in general. And as Dr. Hollie mentioned, kind of that anemic soil, that kind of thing. What can consumers do? What can we as average people do to combat some of that?
So I think one thing that we can easily do, regardless of the environment that you're in, is starting small with your own garden, right? And one thing I'll say is beneficial is also community gardens, because community gardens are where you can sort of share some of that responsibility across your community, and you can share some of the foods that are grown there, right? And it's all about starting small. Yes, we are exposed to many of these environmental pollutants, but we can do our best with what we have. So for myself, I have a small garden in my own home. And I don't need to use synthetic chemicals there because it's in my own backyard. And starting with that, I think, is a great step towards what we can actually do and taking that power into our own hands. I'll also say one of the things I also do is I frequent farm stands in my area. These are small farms, and some of them organic farms who are using regenerative agriculture in their practices. So look around in your community to see where you can partner with others who are using practices that you are comfortable with, and try to do what you can in your own sphere as well.
Thank you very much. That leads beautifully into the next question, which is for those who are living in more urban environments and they want to support local farmers, what kinds of questions regarding soil health might they ask when they're trying to figure out the best choices for food at a farmer's market?
So I would say if it's a small farmer, number one, you don't want to intimidate the small farmer with a lot of, maybe a lot of questions, but you can ask things like, how often that soil is tested, because you do want to test that soil every couple of years or so, the pH, the nutrient of that soil. You want to look for transparency. So you can ask questions around things like heavy metals. I do know that people have those questions. However, just keep in mind that if you have a smaller farmer, they may not have done heavy metal testing. One of the things that you can ask is about the organic matter within the soil itself. Does the farmer do composting? What sort of fertilizers do they use within their farming techniques? So, and one resource I'll mention here is the Soil Health Institute. You can go to the Soil Health Institute and it gives you some tips on what makes good soil health and some questions that you may also be able to ask if you're talking to farmers who are growing foods that you may want.
Thank you very much. I have two questions and then we will wrap it up. One is, you were talking about, and I don't remember specifically, but can the F&B ratio be measured? What is the ideal ratio? 1-to-1?
So typically what's talked about is that the ideal ratio is 2-to-1. Around 2-to-1, or even like 1.5-to-1. That's our current understanding. It can be measured, but there's a caveat there. Clinical gut microbiome testing is right now in its infancy. So the challenge is with interpretation of it. Because it's so individualized, we're so different in our gut microbiome makeup in many ways. that you want to make sure you're not just taking a snapshot in time, but if you want to do that, you want to follow it over time to have an idea of what's happening. But just because you may see 1.7 to 1, that doesn't mean that you are off the rails necessarily. So the challenge is in really interpreting that. I would say just focus on the practices that we talked about today: fiber, polyphenols, probiotics. Feed your gut microbiome with good things, and you should be okay.
Thank you very much. So to wrap things up, we do have, this is a high number of plant-based eaters here on in the webinar this evening in the audience. And we've had several people that have said, okay, I'm eating 12 to 13 different veggies and berries and cherries and all of that or more per day. So what they're saying is, I feel like I'm doing everything right. However, I still have a lot of gas. And why? What could be some of the reasons that is, and how can I address that?
Okay, so that's also not a rapid fire question, but
that's why we're ending with it. So take your time.
I will say this, that there are a variety of reasons that this could be happening, right? One that a good friend always says is, how much are we actually chewing our foods? So that's one thing, right? We say we're supposed to have between 32 to 40 chews. It's something that I've had to be more aware of as well. So we may be eating the right foods, but we may not be chewing appropriately. We also may be eating the right foods, but we may be eating them in the wrong proportions and at the wrong times of day. So, for example, if we are doing a whole lot of snacking throughout the day, it doesn't give our bodies a chance to actually digest that food well enough. And so we may have more symptoms of GI disorders, or GI upset, I should say, and bloating, because we're not giving our bodies the right amount that it needs, or at the right time of day. Also, if we're eating right before bedtime, what that does is that it allows for our bodies to be digesting foods as we are sleeping. And that also disrupts the natural digestive process. One thing I'll say about beans, I know that the person said veggies, but I hear this about beans a lot. Make sure the way that we are cooking those beans is in a way to help to relieve some of those compounds that cause gas. You want to soak your beans, if you can, overnight. If not, at least for 1 hour before you cook them. I'll give you a tip. Kombu seaweed, Kombu, is a type of seaweed that you can add into your beans that literally helps to reduce some of those gas-producing compounds within the beans themselves. So take a look holistically at not just what you're consuming, but how you're consuming. Am I snacking? Am I eating before bed? Am I not chewing enough? Or am I not preparing my foods in the right way? And could this be what's causing the gas that I'm experiencing? So hopefully that helps.
I think that was a beautiful way to wrap it up. And thank you so much, Dr. Sterling.
You're welcome.
Dr. Sterling, this has been amazing,
wow.
Fascinating. My knowledge base for the microbiome and soil microbiome is grown tremendously tonight. So thank you so much. Thank you for the science that you bring. Thank you for the practical tips and the practical knowledge that our audience can put into play in their lives. And also your overall approach, looking at nutrition and exercise and sleep and all these things that we don't sometimes balance accordingly. So thank you so much for your time. I could have talked for hours with you. You have wonderful demeanor about you, and thank you for sharing with our audience. And thank you for your answers. The Q&A was excellent.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you all so much. I mean, it's been great hanging with you for the last hour. So time just flies when you're having fun. So it's been great. Thank you.
It does.
And still lots of questions about, will there be a replay? Indeed, there will be a replay. You'll receive the replay a week from today, so you can watch it at your leisure. Additionally, this will eventually make its way to the CNS YouTube channel as well, so you can share that link with your friends and family.
Yes, and also Natasha will include any references, resources, etc., that Dr. Sterling wants to share with us as well. So, yeah, so that ends our spotlight on health for this November the 12th, my dad's 91st birthday. And we'll be back in January. All right, Natasha? Yeah, we're going to take December off and we'll be back in January and we'll watch your emails. We'll get information to you about that. So, for Spotlight on Health, sponsored by the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies, I'm Mike Hollie, thanking you for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you guys again in the new year. Take care, and thank you, Dr. Sterling.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.